Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is a wonderful turnout, and I recognize so many faces in the audience. We have the right people in the room for this conversation. I'm John Gould. I'm the Dean of the School of Social Ecology, and on behalf of the University of California, Irvine, I am delighted to welcome our guests here, although I gather you've already been here earlier today, so you can welcome me to the room today. We are absolutely delighted to have you and the audience here today for an event that is being sponsored by UCI School of Social Ecology, Social Impact Hub, the UC Irvine Climate Collaboration, and the Department of Urban Planning and Public Policy. I want to credit our Professor Mike Méndez for bringing these excellent speakers, Martha Guzman and Justin Knighten, here. They have decades of knowledge in environmental policy and environmental justice. And if there's a moment that we need to be hearing from them and this expertise, it is now. And indeed, the School of Social Ecology stands with people who are bringing science to the policy arena. For those of you who may not know our school quite as well as those of us who are inside of it, our school is an interdisciplinary set of programs where our scholars don't just study social problems and societal problems, they try to help solve them. And then we try to train the next generation of policymakers and practitioners who will take the lead in bringing needed change to society. And frankly, the entire campus is dedicated to interdisciplinary work, especially on issues of climate and finding partnerships with the community. And that is very much what today's event is about. So you don't need to hear from me much more. Really, the person to hear, or the people to hear from, of course, are our speakers and the moderator, Professor Méndez. But I want to give a moment to introduce one of my favorite collaborators here at UCI, and that is Professor Brett Sanders, who's a Chancellor's Professor in Civil and Environmental Engineering, and he also has a joint appointment in our Department of Urban Planning and Public Policy. He was also recently tasked with standing up the university's Climate Collaboration, for which he's going to share more shortly. Now, he has told me not to say the full bio about him, and I'm going to ignore him, because Professor Sanders is really a dynamo. He's not only a civil and environmental engineer, he's trained in the mechanics of environmental systems and computational methods for simulating the interaction of people and infrastructure with the natural environment. I have no idea, Brett, what that means, but it sounds amazing. Simulation tools give us an eye into the future, allowing us to better assess risks, evaluate response options, and negotiate effective solutions, from new technologies to policy action. Professor Sanders has also experienced with multifaceted research projects that meaningfully engage stakeholders, which is another way of saying that, like our school, Professor Sanders is dedicated to taking science and having it engage with policymakers and practitioners. The integration of new technology, leading science, stakeholder engagement, and policy measures will be vital in creating a sustainable tomorrow for future generations. And if there's one person I know who is helping to train that next generation of scholars and practitioners, and who is himself providing the research to make it possible for practitioners and policymakers to do their work, it is Professor Sanders. So Brett, let me invite you to the stage.
Yeah, thank you, John. That was very generous and kind. It is a pleasure for me to join this group today. As John mentioned, I'm a professor of civil and environmental engineering and urban planning and public policy here at UC Irvine. And even on a more personal level, you know, we've seen all this political uncertainty unfold over the last year. And I think the way you frame like the subtitle of this program is just fabulous, with protecting climate science in an age of political uncertainty. This is such a responsibility that we have as an academic institution to be the sort of guardians of knowledge of science and what we know. And it's such an enormous challenge at this time to even talk about problems without stepping on terminologies or words that that make it difficult to talk about really important issues. I'd like to sort of thank Professor Méndez for his leadership to pull this really forward-thinking program together, and our guests, both Justin Ángel Knighten and Martha Aceves, being a part of this really important conversation that I think we're all really hungry to hear today, because we've all been struggling with this time of uncertainty, like what can we put in our research proposals? How do we talk about what we're doing? Do I need to edit my research paper and sort of maybe talk about this issue a bit differently? So I just can't wait for this conversation to unfold. What we've been doing here at UC Irvine, as Dean Gould has laid out, is as we've tried to come together more as a whole campus around these challenges of climate, and especially what we've rallied around, reading the tea leaves, seeing what seems to be undeniable and impossible to ignore, is that the warming climate we live in is impacting economies, it's impacting people through heat waves. We see hurricanes driving through Jamaica. We just saw native peoples on the coast of Alaska get destroyed by a storm surge. We even saw the senator from Alaska talking about the need for climate resilience. I don't know if anyone caught that, but we just saw words like resilience coming out of the mouths of our elected leaders. And so it's not going away. We need to be thinking about this, but we need to also navigate this really sort of tricky future of uncertainty, of political uncertainty. We've relied on a government that spread out responsibility for risk management across local, state, and federal governments. And now what seems to be happening is we're hearing a federal government say, we don't really want to be responsible for so much of what's happening at the local level. So we don't know what's going to happen to our federal programs like the National Flood Insurance Program. Does that mean every state's going to emerge with maybe its own approach and do something different? Could we see a diversity of approaches across all the states? And maybe that could be good. Maybe that could drive innovation to have a diversity of approaches. But I think we'll find there's a lot of states that don't have resources to manage these problems. So this is just a fascinating time, and I want to credit the panel for bringing forward such an important topic to our community here, where we've been wrestling with this and dealing with the challenges of terminated grants and terminated jobs and projects that we thought were going to come and fund our resilience in our community that have been pulled back and aren't happening anymore. So thank you so much for being here today. And I'd like to introduce really the sort of, I think, the brainchild of this event today, which is Professor Mike Méndez. And Professor Méndez is an Irvine Chancellor's Fellow, Associate Professor of Urban Planning and Public Policy, a visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. Before coming to Irvine, he was a Pinchot Faculty Fellow at the Yale School of the Environment. And his first book, Climate Change from the Streets, which was published by Yale University Press, was the winner of the Harold and Margaret Sprout Award, sponsored by the International Studies Association and the Association for Humanist Sociology's Betty and Alfred McClung-Neat Award. And in 2022, he was awarded the very prestigious Carnegie Fellowship. And perhaps one of the greatest recognitions is when I have a student in my fluid mechanics class who took your class and said it was better than my class. Guys, thank you. Please welcome Mike Méndez.
Thank you, Brett, for those kind words, and most of all, the sponsorship of this important event. Also, Dean Gould for his courageousness to help us bring together such an amazing panel, and of course, Raven, who has been herding the cats to get everyone here and make sure that our guests are well taken care of. Before I begin, I want to kind of get an idea of who's in the room. How many students do we have? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of them are social scientists or humanities? Okay. How many are from the STEM? Okay, so a little bit more STEM, so great. And then the rest, you can see faculty or staff or from the general public. So before I introduce our esteemed panel of experts, I want to direct this sort of opening of giving it the context of the moment we're living in, particularly for students. Many of us understand that many of the work that we do here in the Academy is under fire. And because of that, we intentionally named this event Under Fire, because all the things we hold dear in the Academy are in flames or, as Brett mentioned, are being threatened. This includes basic science, social science research, grants, funding, teaching, and even our intellectual curiosity. According to the New York Times, this has been one of the worst years for the American scientific enterprise in modern history. Since January, as many of you know, the Trump administration has drastically cut science funding, slashing over $1 billion from the National Science Foundation and $4.5 billion from the National Institutes of Health. Thousands of science jobs have been lost or frozen across federal agencies, including CDC, the EPA, which Martha Guzman used to be a part of, NOAA, and FEMA, which Justin is from. In both state and Ivy League schools, these sweeping cuts represent deep personal losses. These impacts include loss of jobs, dismantled labs, halted experiments, graduate students denied access to graduate degrees. This results in the loss of knowledge, progress, and investments. In more practical sense, this really creates people's dreams that are delayed or deferred. The 2006 budget proposal by the White House would further slash the National Science Foundation by 57% and the NIH by 39%. It would almost entirely eliminate the U.S. Geological Survey, $300 million budget for ecosystems research. There's also proposals to shut down NASA and NOAA satellites that research and governments around the world depend on for forecasting weather and natural hazards. According to the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, or AAAS, this would result in essentially the end of U.S. long-standing role as the world leader in science and innovation. These statistics and quotes are from the New York Times new series on lost science. This series is asking dozens of scientists from across the country to describe what has been lost as a result of these changes. They provide a first-person perspective of these real impacts at the ground level. While our guests today are not trained scientists, they are policy experts that actively engage around regulatory science and policy, translating scientific facts to programs that protect our society, and most importantly, vulnerable populations from the impacts of climate change. Unfortunately, many of the projects they worked on can now be classified as being part of that long list of lost science. So now I'd like to introduce our esteemed panel of guests. The first is Martha Guzman, who has more than 25 years of experience in state and federal governments, where she has focused on developing and implementing equity-based solutions to energy, water, agriculture, and environmental sectors. As regional administrator for the US EPA, she has led efforts to protect public health and the environment for the region spanning across California, Hawaii, Nevada, and the US Pacific territories, and 148 tribal nations. She also was very instrumental in state government here in California, working in Sacramento, being the right-hand person on environmental policies and legislation for former Governor Jerry Brown. Justin Knighten is a nationally recognized public affairs, communications, and political strategist with expertise in national security, climate, resilience, and sustainability. And he is based in Washington, D.C., and is the co-founder of Pinnacle Collective Public Affairs, and serves as an executive advisor with LA-based Mosaic Media Communications. And he served as a senior official in the Biden-Harris administration as FEMA's associate administrator directing the Office of External Affairs, which included congressional affairs, media relations, tribal affairs, and crisis communication. He was also the point person for the White House and coordinating federal agencies when federal disaster emergencies were declared. So as you can see, we have a wealth of information, a wealth of expertise on this panel, and we look forward to being in conversation with them. So to begin this panel today, I'd like to ask my first question, where I'm asking each of you to briefly introduce yourselves and the capacities in which you work for state and federal government. And then most importantly, speaking a little bit about that lost science, giving that first-hand perspective of perhaps a program that you were passionate about, worked for, and is no longer on existence or has been dismantled.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, Michael already said much of what I have done. I did start off working for Jerry Brown on much of his environmental, agricultural, climate, energy legislation. And from there, I was Public Utilities Commissioner here in California. And then from there, I recently went to the federal government and worked under Biden for the US EPA. I think we're very fortunate in California, but having been in the role of the Pacific Southwest Regional Administrator, not all of that region is as fortunate. I mean, certainly the territories, even Hawaii, the tribes, and Arizona, Nevada. I mean, they just don't have the economy that California does to really be able to invest in the type of continuation of both policy and research. I'll give a couple of examples on the federal level, of course. Some that I was thinking up until a couple weeks ago were safe, and it just continues to get retracted and taken back. So most of the funding that was under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act that came to EPA was in two buckets. One was under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, infrastructure funding. That's water, wastewater, everything from, recycled water, water supply enhancement, anything like that. That money is safe, because most of that money is a formula-fed funding to the states and tribes and territories. And so that was a very fortunate thing, because under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, it was $50 billion for that enhanced infrastructure, something that was a tenfold from usual years. And it came in a very important time. As Southern Californians, the reduction of the Colorado supply being just one example of the need to have greater, recycled infrastructure, among many other things. And in the Inflation Reduction Act, unfortunately, most of that money, because it was, after the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, was still in the process of being expended. And that's why a lot of that funding was able to be taken back. So I want to give an example there that I mentioned a little bit earlier. In the environmental justice funding that EPA got, there was $3 billion for environmental justice grants. And a lot of that money was, clawed back pretty quickly. And, some of these projects are water infrastructure projects. There was a project in the Pajaro Valley, you guys know, up by Watsonville, that area. And it was going to connect hundreds of households into a public infrastructure that they run well water that's largely contaminated with TCP and nitrates. Gone, absolutely gone. Positive story there is the state is now agreed to fund that project. That's over $20 million worth of funding that the state is committing. Arizona doesn't have that, Nevada doesn't have that, Hawaii doesn't have that, the territories don't. So the other example that just happened a few weeks ago that I thought was in the safe zone was an energy project, which was for the Hopi Nation. Many of you know the Hopi Nation is kind of in the northeast corner of Arizona and wholly surrounded by the Navajo Nation. And they are very remote. But a little bit of a side story, they have the longest continuous community in existence in North America. So they have been living there in perpetuity longer than anywhere else in North America. And they are not fully powered. Many of their households did not have electricity availability to them. And this $20 million project was giving them distributed solar generation to connect many of their homes to have the ability to, run a microwave sometimes, keep the lights on, things like that, basic things that we take for granted. That money, as of a few weeks ago, was taken back. Interestingly enough, it was one of those pots that folks in this administration were trying to backfill through other money, and I think they found it was less than $2 million out of a DOE pot that they found acceptable. which is obviously not sufficient for this community. And then I'll just say, within the agency, it's been just horrendous. The Office of Research and Development, where not just internal to the agency, but the public could come, worked with the community in the Central Valley, partly there, that had an air need. San Joaquin Valley has the largest PM problem in the nation. And they wanted to really study if there was some causality with some of the megadairies and some of the ammonia with the PM formation in their communities, particularly in the winter. And so we did kind of like a baseline study in the summer, found a lot of interesting work that, just finished and have some findings. The work needs to continue through the winter, and that's not going to happen. So, figuring out strategies, not just for climate, but for basic public health, is really being impacted. And so I guess we're starting with the bad story, so that'll stop there.
Great segue to FEMA, which is being dismantled across the board. But first, just thank you to UC Irvine. Thank you, Professor Méndez, and the center for having us here, having this conversation. And thanks to all of you for caring about this conversation and doing work actively in this space. Not only do we need you today, we're going to need you for years and decades to come, because I think what this moment is doing in our country is surfacing either historic neglect on these issues to actually solve for them and not to meet a political moment or to satisfy immediate pressure and kind of move on to the next thing, but actually systemically look at these issues and solve for them, which means being bold, being brave, being the agitators and instigators that are actually going to seep into these issues and systemically change the systems and structures and policies and funding mechanisms to address them systemically, so that it's harder for future political shifts to create such chaos and turmoil in virtually every community, especially in the communities that are going to have the hardest time when disasters hit. I said this stat this morning, or this point this morning, but if you ask the United Nations Office of Disaster Risk Reduction, they'll tell you that there's no such thing as disasters. The disaster is simply a hazard, meaning a vulnerability. And when you think about the risk landscape and the work that I do, the reason why I'm in this space, first starting in the Governor Newsom administration doing emergency management specific to vulnerable populations, then being asked to do this at FEMA, where my office looked at and was actively involved in every decision that FEMA made in every aspect of the mission, from before disaster and building up mitigation, right? Looking at all the risks that our country faces, both man-made, weather, et cetera, and helping to come up with granting programs, structure strategies, and engagement to help build up the resilience levels in our country, build them up stronger before these hazards hit. To the active response, right? What do you do when a disaster hits and communities don't have the capacity to do it themselves? Don't listen to the rhetoric we keep hearing on and on about FEMA. It is fundamental to emergency management that locals execute when they need support. The state steps in to provide management help, and then when the state is overwhelmed with either capacity, funding, or expertise, they will ask the federal government to come in, and then certainly the recovery after, which y'all in California know how hard it is to build a home on a good day like today. It gets infinitely worse in a crisis or in a recovery when infrastructure and sewage and power lines have also been destroyed. And so we can have those conversations. But when I think about the risk landscape and why I do this work and what I did at FEMA, I mean, if you think about last year alone, 154 presidentially declared disasters or federal grants were issued in response to crisis across about 55 or so US states, tribal nations, and territories. It's about one disaster, one catastrophic national disaster every 2 days. That pace is definitely happening now. We're just not seeing that level of federal engagement or action or support. And in some cases, because of politics, we're actually seeing decisions being made to prevent people from getting these systems of support. So when I think about the work I did at FEMA and what is the most difficult to watch is that the whole infrastructure of FEMA has been attacked. Either programs have gone away, staff who've had decades of experience have been run out. And this might be breaking news, but I just heard today that the LGBTQ employee resource group at the university might be targeted to be fired for being at FEMA for being a hostile work environment practitioners or whatever they're using to frame it. So, you can't have a system of federal support, which, by the way, FEMA is also intimately connected to our national security. Those of you who remember the civil defense days of duck and cover under your desks for the Cold War scare of Soviet missiles coming to the US, is actively, directly, intimately connected to the FEMA mission, in addition to climate change, et cetera. And so when I think about the work that I did that is going away, it's translating information to reach more populations. There's an executive order to require everything to be only in English. When I think about the work I did at FEMA that's gone away is actively building partnerships with underserved populations, older adults, people living in rural areas, people with disabilities, and the list goes on, to understand their barriers, their perception, their reality, so that we could create feedback models to learn and adapt our systems and policies accordingly so that they could actually get the aid that they needed in a crisis and before. Oh, by the way, changes that help everybody access those programs easier have gone away. It's not happening. So it's difficult to watch, but it's also a motivation factor to do things like this and to be connected with leaders like yourselves so that we can bond around what comes next.
Thank you for providing us with that overview, both of you, of some of the lost programs, lost science, lost research programs that you work so hard to champion and get implemented and see that rolled back or entirely dismantled. With that in mind, in the absence of federal leadership on climate change policy and science, what can state and local governments do to support climate action?
Well, obviously here in California, there's a lot of great examples of leadership on this, but it is going to be a little different, even in the areas where we've excelled, like in the air regulatory area, where we have traditionally been granted waivers, and the federal government said, yes, since we're not acting here, go ahead, California, particularly around vehicle emission standards. That has now really been taken away by the federal government. And we're going to have to do it differently. We may have to use our own state authorities to carry some of this out. We're going to be challenged, Commerce Clause, etc. And so the collaborations are going to require us to use the people power to really go beyond just a regulatory framework, but go beyond, being in touch with communities and how this relates ever more to people's lives. It's not the solution. I am definitely a believer in regulation. So it's the bridge to the next administration that can really bring some of this back. In some areas, there's no preemption, like our clean energy standards. Those are not currently at risk, although it's still, and I don't want to knock on wood here that it doesn't come tomorrow and try to use some sort of preemption effort to prevent us from going forward. But, just again, being more focused on the West here, we have a strong hold on those policies throughout the Pacific corridor with Washington, Oregon, California, and Hawaii. All of us stand really to get a cleaner energy supply. A little bit different years by each of us, but that is not going away. What's going away is the acceleration we were receiving from the federal government. And what's that going to require? It's going to require more innovation and more collective pooling of our resources. One example of that was a big measure that passed this year in the California legislature was the authorization to further regionalize our transmission grid so that we can both import and export more of all power, granted, but more renewable power into areas of the West that do not have that, including ourselves that I was just mentioning to these guys. This is the last month that DWP will be on coal. They're still, we ourselves are not pure yet, so we're still in that transition. But, I think we have to continue this activity that we're doing here. We have to continue to build from the ground up, continue to really research and think about innovative ways to get places without that federal subsidization and without that federal overarching regulatory framework. And that, more so than the funding, it's the regulatory framework that is the biggest loss from my perspective. So what are we doing in Arizona? What are we doing in Hawaii? What are we doing in Nevada? Places that are our neighbors that really have similar constituencies to us, that we can make some of these policies happen there as well.
Yeah, I think for me, I always look at everything through a communicator's lens, and how are we communicating to different audiences? And I think what works in a policy forum or a legislative space or in government offices often doesn't work with the general public. And I think that moments like now, when everyone's feeling anxious, they're feeling their foundation cracked, they're feeling uncertain about what happens next on fill in the blank, I think it's an opportunity for every political leader, someone who's working in governance in any way, private sector, across the board in California, to take firmer hold of the narrative and the why. And what do I mean by that? I think that the word climate change, and before we used climate change, it was global warming, both are very academic, they're abstract, and kind of feel very sterile to a lot of people. But it's not to say that people who are younger don't really care about climate change, and we see the polling, and all that's true. But when you ask people to understand something like, why are you building a seawall? Or why are you justifying the need for this policy that's going to do X, Y, and Z? I think sometimes we use language that is inaccessible to a lot of people or feels super overwhelming, and we don't really actually penetrate what we need to help them understand and connect the dots. People are busy. Just getting people to understand something is a huge hurdle. But oftentimes in this conversation and the science that we're talking about, we don't want people just to understand it. We want them to do something differently. Well, that's $1 billion industry across every issue sector in the world. But we have to compete in that space. And so how do we use language and use narrative in a way that's more accessible and clean? I think about a couple months ago, maybe about a month ago at New York Climate Week during the UNGA General Assembly. And former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger did an event with former Prime Minister Tony Blair. Regardless of what you think about them politically, they had this really interesting conversation about the environmental work they did almost 20 years ago in passing AB 32. It's like world first climate emission legislation out of Sacramento. I was in Cal EPA at the time when that was happening, was really proud to be there. There's been debate on the effectiveness of that program, but a lot of good things came up with it. And it was a Republican that got that passed in a progressive legislature at the time. And they talked a lot about how global warming was the language of the time 20 years ago, and how when they did polling during the passage of that legislation, it was really hard to get people to support it because it was raining. And okay, well, how is the world warming if it's raining and cold, right? It was inaccessible. And they changed the narrative, and they stopped using Cal EPA and the governor's office stopped using global warming, and they started talking about air pollution. The air is polluted, it's making kids sick in the Central Valley. They used research and data, many of whom I'm sure were connected to UC Irvine, that showed that kids needed inhalers, they couldn't breathe. They showed that human impacts this dirty air. It's the same thing with water. This water is dirty. This water is making us sick. We have to clean this dirty water, dirty air, pollution, bad water. And it actually moved public opinion to build the political will that helped get this legislation to pass. And so we kind of have to change and be less preachy in the words that we're using and the way that we're trying to frame the science and the data to actually move people in a different way and help connect the dots. It's more relatable to their everyday lives.
Great, thank you. These are both examples of, because of the times we're living in the twin crisis of political and climate crisis, we're being forced to think differently about the work that we do, either if it's a narrative in our messaging of how do you have a people-centered approach to our policymaking process, or rethinking entire regulatory frameworks and the constraints that they encounter. On another avenue, generally, even before this historic political and climate crisis, there was often a mistrust of government and local communities, where if the government workers or community organizations related with those government workers came into a particular neighborhood or a city, and there was mistrust. That sort of mistrust was exasperated through concerted efforts in the past years to have misinformation campaigns around climate change and the environmental work of governments. And so the question is, have you had that experience of these strategic misinformation campaigns in the work that you have done, and how, if you could, how did you overcome it? Or try to overcome it?
Well, first there's misinformation, and to the point you just raised, with communities that have been historically shut out, left out, or forgotten, right? And they don't trust government because government historically hasn't really been there for them. In fact, Professor Méndez's research on the intersection of vulnerable communities and climate we use in the governor's office to actually help get the legislature to fund some campaigns to actually do work to engage these populations. So, perfect example of using some research and science to help fuel different decisions in a policy standpoint. And in a crisis, whether it's fueled by disaster, climate or not, rumors exist, and they've always existed since the beginning of time. Because there's chaos. There's chaos in people's minds, in their own community. You just lost your house. Maybe you've lost a parent. You don't know if you're gonna have a job in 2 days because you don't know what's happening to them. There's a lot of difficult reality kind of setting in for you. And the human mind, there's science behind this, of how you can process information hours after a crisis, after a hurricane or a tornado, the days after, right? It all is part of this well-orchestrated science. The challenge that we're seeing now is that this is being fully exacerbated by the bad actors domestically who are trying to win politically. This happened during Hurricane Helene last year with a campaign that ultimately won the election, where there's a lot of misinformation being pushed out that was actually fundamentally wrong. The problem is it was happening so fast and getting so much traction that it was hard to correct it. And the regular fact checkers of reporters wasn't really doing it. Right? It was just happening so quickly because we're all in information silos, right? The information space that we're in is so siloed that there's no one thing you can do to fix it. It's kind of whack-a-mole across the board. TikTok, Instagram, local community papers, local radio, national TV, and everything in between. Members of Congress, mayors, right? It's all of it because it spreads so quickly. No pun intended, it spreads like wildfire. What's also happening is, and not to get super dark, but we're noticing that this is actually a setting that our foreign adversaries are using more and more in the US. And they've been using it more as a strategy the last couple of years. First in Ohio with the train derailment. That was connected to an investigation that was done by the Associated Press that found that a lot of that misinformation was actually connected to the Kremlin. And then cut to Lahaina and the wildfires in Hawaii. I could tell something was happening. I could tell something was viscerally wrong and not normal because the amount of misinformation, like Jewish space lasers at the top of the mountain started the fire to kill people, that money was not available to help people because it was going to Ukraine. These are all narratives that even if someone had come up with locally, was being exacerbated and spun up to sow distrust, further distrust in government, to create more chaos and confusion that made that response significantly more difficult. So by the time we got to Hurricane Helene, it was across the board at levels that we have never seen before. And the reason why I'm bringing this up, and that, by the way, was connected to Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran. At least that's what the intelligence says. It's a little difficult to pinpoint exactly confirmatively, but we're pretty sure. The reason I bring this up is to say that the information environment that we're operating in on climate-related issues is becoming more intense. In fact, the UN next month at COP is going to take on this issue specifically globally around information integrity as it relates to climate change, because they are finding that this is not only a phenomenon happening in the US, this is a phenomenon happening in other countries around disaster, around climate. And so I think so far on this MOU, I think it's the UK, Spain, and France, maybe Canada will sign on, we'll see, to actually commit to a set of principles to start taking this on head on, because it's that challenging, it's that dangerous.
Well, I just want to point out that the examples that Justin gave were all EPA-related response when we were responding. Obviously, during Lahaina was multi-agency, but it was a very, very steep realization and learning curve on how to respond, not just to like external criticism, but something that was coming from Russia, primarily in bots and at a speed and at a frequency that was consuming particularly the social media information streams. And the silver lining of that, in the case of Lahaina, which I mentioned a little bit to the earlier group, is that our need to rely on community leaders as the trusted voices, you know, is everything from what's in the soil, is the air safe to breathe, can we, you know, do we trust that the water testing for, you know, being able to turn back on the water is safe? Every element of the work was being questioned. And we were able, in the case of Lahaina, to partner with the local kupuna. It's like this ancient structure of governance came back. And they all had essentially their local leadership come back into fulfillment. And they became the messengers, and everything had to go through them. The mayor empowered them for everything to go through them. And then the mayor set up a more structured advisory council that had a diversified group of folks. There was a representation from the business community, from the Filipino community, which was a big part, and from the Native Hawaiian community. So all of that noise was really able to be blocked out at that point because everyone was able to see it for what it was. But it took us like 2 months to get through that. And that's a lot of drain on folks. It also happened to us, by the way, and I do want to recognize that Hawaii and the territories are particularly vulnerable to this, particularly from China and Russia on this type of thing. And when we were responding to one of the major spills, essentially, that happened in Honolulu at Pearl Harbor, Hickam, that had a horrible situation there where some old jet fuel was leaked directly into the drinking water supply of the entire base. And so it wasn't like, you know, the typical contamination through the years. It goes through the soil, into the groundwater, you start to see some levels in the water. This was into the head of the well, out into the distribution system. So the contamination was immediate and pervasive, and that's a whole other story. But part of the issue there was that, again, and I think it was actually Russia, again, that took advantage of the situation and created massive misinformation. And we didn't have the situation that we had in Lahaina for that local leadership. We tried to create it, and it was a very distinct situation because we were on a base, so the structure and obviously the command controller is very unique. But once it became aware that, I mean, there was like a community meeting at one point, the whole streaming was interrupted by, and actually I think that one was Iran. And it was like horrible what was shown. So it was a breaking point though, because the community folks finally realized that they had been receiving information that was not coming from a trusted source all the time. So But it really has a huge impact on the ability for community to trust the information that they're getting from government.
To jump a bit behind that, this gets further complicated by the reality of the history of Hawaii and the relationship with the U.S. government. And there's arguably and obviously a lot of challenging relationship dynamics between the two. What's also true is that during this misinformation campaign, the locals were very much concerned about the burn scars and all the death that happened, and wanting to be very respectful of those families that lost loved ones. So while the misinformation was happening, they didn't want to show burn scars, which the national media, California specifically, during all the wildfires that we've had, have a rule that reporters can go right up to the fire line. Reporters have like almost full access during a fire because California has made the decision that these catastrophic events are so bad that we need everyone to see them up close and understand them and understand the operations to address them and to see the devastation fully, full access. So when you have this level of misinformation and then you have this overlay of just already a challenging relationship in history with kind of cultural practice and tradition, it created more distrust of reporters, national media, credible media saying, what are you hiding? Why don't you want us to see this? And so I took it on the chin a couple of times because I really fought to get reporters to see, because I did California wildfires. I know how quickly reporters can turn if they feel like they're being blocked from that access, to get them in to see as much as they could. And I bring this up to say that not only are we dealing with misinformation, but we're also dealing with very specific communities that have their own traditions and cultures, and that becomes another layer that we'll have to work through as we think about the onset of more and more catastrophic climate-fueled events.
Thank you. Your responses are very enlightening. I bet many of us didn't know of the various external forces that were providing this misinformation to many communities that were in stress. Many of these communities experiencing some of the worst experiences of their lives and being an onslaught of misinformation. But with that in mind, many of the students here work in the climate world, ideally want to impact society through the research that they're doing, either working with government or local communities. What advice would you give to them what is the right way to do responsible work with a local community that may have a level of distrust of academics or government?
I don't think it's overly complicated, really. It's always starting with the humanity of a person. I think we'd like to go into some of these public forums and really start with the business at hand without taking the time to acknowledge, the humans amongst us. And that has different settings and different practices with who you meet with. I know when we met a lot with the different tribal nations, interestingly enough, prayer is still a very common way for them to begin a meeting. And the recognition that they give to their ancestors before every meeting is a must. Most of the time, when we were, even in other settings like Hawaii, where there's still a heavy cultural presence, there was also a different practice of beginning a meeting. So each community will be different. I mean, any way that you can build the humanity in people, the humanity amongst yourselves, oftentimes in a hostile setting where we're coming in to talk about, people haven't been able to drink their water, or people haven't been able to move back in, or their soil hasn't been tested, or what have you. A lot of times it's reminding them that me, myself, and our staff are people too, and that talking a little bit about who we were, and that we were, parents, or that we were, in this career, where we were from, and just the humanization of government, because that's all government is. It's a bunch of people who are trying to do societal work. And so it slows down a meeting perhaps, but it's an incredibly important practice of actually just being a human with other humans.
I totally agree. I mean, I kind of take the example maybe that happened before during some missions at FEMA where it's like this parachute in, be the federal government, and parachute out. Hasn't happened, I think, in many years, certainly when I was at the agency. And really intentional about that practice, that cultural competency, the engagement. And I think the same is for academia. Like, we've all seen examples, and we all know those examples of research that has been done, certainly in the disaster space, of people who come from their ivory tower, parachute into a community, and kind of impose their own view of how people should live and how they should be and who they are, to do research about them because they're vulnerable. Not calling anyone out, but I think we know what some of those institutions and those entities are. And it's different with the lens of doing it from community, doing it in partnership with, even coming from community yourself, who you have a connection and a touch point in some way, or you have a relationship or build a relationship with people that do. I mean, I think about your research, professor, around farm worker communities, and that you build relationships with organizations that serve farm workers. And so you might have known that farm workers often don't speak Spanish, or they're speaking other indigenous languages from Mexico, Tiki, Mixteco, etc. But you had an organization that was there with you, partnering with you to help be that expert and that kind of resource and connection to do it in a way that is culturally competent, that is with them, that is respectful, so that the research ultimately reflects their truth in a way that helps drive new awareness, right? A sense of what the facts are, etc. And so I think that's about the approach, it's the how you're doing it, and the why.
Can I just add to that? Because there are a couple instances throughout my career where, especially dealing with scientists that have a lot of information, a lot of accuracy, a lot of facts, a lot of evidence to why perhaps they feel that exposing communities to this amount of uranium has no risk, or explaining to a community that actually the dairy next door doesn't have any sort of causality to higher levels of PM. And that kind of lack of accepting, whether you want to call it local knowledge in the most egregious form, when there's a complete dismissal of indigenous knowledge, of people's knowledge of where they've been for centuries, to where people have lived their whole lives, maybe 40, 50 years, and what they believe to be true. And it is not sufficient to just come in and say, this is what the science says and you're wrong. That doesn't change anything. It will just create distrust. And we're used to, as scientists, moving in a linear direction. And so anything that takes us off of that, or that slows us down from that linear direction, is seen as maybe unworthy. And what is really worthy is actually having that buy-in. And sometimes you can get there through more explanation and really more training on understanding perhaps the, actual scientific explanation that's super helpful. But also, sometimes you have to run their test, run their theory. And even though you know 100% from your scientific side that theory is going to fail, you still run it because it creates that trust in the community that is worthwhile. And you know what's funny about that process? 9 times out of 10, you're going to find out more information from that. It's not maybe going to fail your scientific theory, but you're going to learn something from that. That's been my experience. And so really that comes down to respecting the community's knowledge and respecting their perspective. And instead of just debating it as wrong, is finding a path forward of potentially examining some of those things, certainly trying to further educate on it, but being open to actually learning from community.
great important points and really hones into moving with the speed of trust with a community and building that relationship rather than being extractive and not understanding the contextual issues in that local area. With in a similar question, many of these individuals here, students in particular, are working on projects that serve a public purpose, will either likely improve communities, but oftentimes they want to be able to translate it into policy. We talked a little bit about that with the morning class. What advice would you give to academics that are testifying or trying to get policymakers and elected officials to listen to their research and try to implement it in policy? Advice or pet peeves that you may have of what they're doing wrong, but any guidance you can provide.
So I've spent most of my career helping people do this. Mostly based in Sacramento, helping people testify, helping people understand how to communicate in a way that's going to move the needle. And what I always tell people is it's not about you or your research. It's about the people you're talking to. Who are they? Who's your audience? Who are they? What is their relation to that topic? What do they know or don't know about that topic? And really spend the time thinking about what it is you want them to do with the information that you provide. Because then you're going to be thinking about the audience, which is the most important. You're going to be thinking about what is it you want them to do or to change or to shift. And then you can then decide what is the messaging and the information and the way to present it to resonate with the audience and to get at not what I want to happen, not what I think the research should be embraced as, but as what I'm trying to get them to do with that information. Whether it's even just building their awareness. Okay, but how are you gonna do it in a way that's gonna resonate with them? Because they don't have your experience, they don't have your level of expertise. And they have 5 minutes, and we have to be a little bit thinking about the fact that entertainment and how you portray yourself and get information across goes a long way to resonate with the person you're trying to reach. And so it's just taking a beat and saying, okay, I have this expertise. I myself, though, cannot live in a vacuum. And just because I don't care about it and find it interesting, most people don't. So how do I sell it in a way that will resonate and get people to pay attention and to care, and then arguably to also, more importantly, do something with that information.
And I would just say, the fact that you're even showing up to any of these settings where there's decision-making happening is incredible right now. And so that's the hardest part, is having that, courage to show up and to say, I'm a UC researcher, or I'm a UC PhD. Right there alone, you have an incredible amount of credential to speak to the subject. So be brave. It's a time for that courage right now for you to be speaking that truth. So it's an incredible part of just showing up.
Thank you for that. That's actually quite inspiring. And maybe a little bit before we turn it over to the audience questions, I want to lean a little bit more into why you do the work that you do, especially in this current climate where government workers, public officials are being denigrated or attacked. Why do you continue to work in public service, and what keeps you hopeful in this profession?
For myself, I think that there's a little bit of an obligation feeling to continuing in this work, because having had the privilege to serve in state and federal government now, in helping folks navigate, where is that decision maker? How best do you communicate it? What is their concern? And really helping bridge that gap for folks. I'll give an example of what's inspiring to me, coming kind of back into the state side. One of the clients I have up north with the Winnemem-Wintu tribe that, was on the head of the Shasta, where all of you get water from, the Sacramento Bay Delta watershed. And, for the entire time that I had been familiar with their issues, they had not been listened to. And I just had a meeting this morning on it where they said that Westlands Water District, the largest irrigation district in this nation, has agreed to give them full access to the ancestral land at the head of the Shasta. So, these are like the landowners of, the West that you think about that, dammed up all the rivers and all that stuff. That's what we're talking about here. And there's recognition, even from them, the unlikelies, that this type of partnership is in their best interest. I have, particularly when things are happening that I have nothing to do with, and they're like so extraordinary, it's like, that gives me hope. There are people across our communities at every sector and every level that are actually doing this work for the sake of the work and for the sake, a little bit of their own interest in their own community and their own business. But these unlikely partnerships are happening right now in a time where they can go to this administration and get whatever they want. They're choosing to partner with one of the poorest tribes in this, definitely in the state, to give them something that they've been seeking for decades. I mean, I'm not going to say centuries because I don't know that one, but definitely for centuries and decades.
I would say for me, so I had the honor of working at FEMA. It was the hardest thing I've ever done. And I still can't believe I lasted for 4 years. And people who've had the job before me were like, can't believe you lasted for 4 years. But I had the honor of representing and supporting the first woman to ever run the agency, Deanne Criswell. And I think she's the best FEMA administrator to have ever run FEMA. She squarely put a focus on people, in which before it was on property and it was on many other priorities. And she said, no, the most important is people. We have to be people-centered in everything that we do. And I miss working for her every day. And she said something to me in our first meeting, and she said, Justin, from challenge comes change. And it's so simple, one of those pearls of wisdom that you hear people say. But I was like, oh, that's profound. Let's use it in the speech. And I was like, let's actually use it to like be part of your narrative, right, about the work. And I hadn't really thought about those words until this year, until we left our jobs, until we left the Biden-Harris administration, and we have all been witnessing what is happening in the world, in our country. And I keep coming back to from challenge comes change, because it is in the moments, the dark moments, the challenging moments, the difficult moments, the hard moments, both for ourselves and our own lives, where we get to flex a muscle and learn, or we get to test our own resilience, or we get to grow in ways that we never thought possible. But I also think for the communities that we live and the policies that we think about and the politics that we practice, we get to take this as a moment to not keep getting overwhelmed by the barrage of brute force, but maybe turn that off a little bit to focus on some of our energy around how to recreate, how to reimagine, how to restructure, how to build new alliances, how to think about some of the richest, wealthiest stakeholders with those that are historically disadvantaged and are challenged, like the tribal nation you're working with, and think about how to bring those two together because they have a shared goal. Like, that is the work, and that is the change that brings me hope.
Those are both wonderful responses, and really acknowledging, well, we're all experiencing this crisis currently in our environmental professions, but there are hope, and that's an opportunity to think bigger, to reimagine our current frameworks and try to still help those that are most vulnerable in our society and our planet as well. So with that, we have a couple minutes, about 15 minutes left for audience questions.
If anyone has a question, please raise your hand and I will come bring the microphone to you so everyone can hear it. Yes, coming over to you, sir.
Thank you for this excellent presentation. I was really interested to hear from you all, and I think we ended with a note of hope and how to keep going. My question is actually for Ms. Guzman. Last year I was involved with this climate pollution reduction grant, as a merit reviewer for EPA. And I, like all of last spring, we were going through some amazing applications, right? And I think in July last summer, the announcement was made for like 25 applications all over the country for about $4.3 billion, I believe, on energy efficiency, transportation, greenhouse gas reduction projects. And there were also, I believe, about $300 million were being given to the tribes and territorial applications. So that was a pretty intense process. And I know from within EPA and like outside contractors like me were involved in reviewing, and then those announcement was made. So I'm just wondering where they stand now, and if it's not positive, like, would you foresee that those would continue later on? So yeah, because I'm not sure what's going on. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you know, those have largely not been clawed back. A lot of that is because they were not structured in the same way that like the EJ grants were, because all of that have to go to governments. So, you know, they were able to give the money to the government right away. Unlike some of the, you know, the other grants where you have to invoice for repayment. I certainly cannot predict what is further on the chopping block, but I think a lot of that money was expended, but I'd have to check, honestly. There's so much of it that's gotten taken back. Yeah. But thank you for working on that. You know, we talked about it earlier that I think we've learned a lot of lessons in terms of the, you know, going at the level of trust, or what's it saying?
Moving at the speed of trust.
Moving at the speed of trust, but there is a cost to that, which is not having it safely invested in a timely way. So, you know, we have to be conscious of that trade-off.
Other questions? Yes.
Hello, hi, thank you so much for being here. I am Professor Maria Rendon, had you all in my morning class, so thank you so much. My question is for thinking about my undergraduate students who are interested in all these issues, and you know, it's a very it's a very interesting time that we're living, and they're thinking about their future and jobs. What advice do you have for our young students, undergraduates, who are thinking about professions, thinking about climate change, thinking about these things that really are important, disasters, in this current moment, not only in terms of careers, because I'm pretty sure you can share a little bit about your paths, but maybe skills that you think are very valuable in this time. And I'm thinking about the context of misinformation, of AI, and everything's moving so fast. So if you could speak on that, that'd be wonderful.
You have a great Amazon story. I mean, we've talked about in this context that the work is not going away. You know, the work is maybe not going to be available at EPA or FEMA in the next few years, but it's going to be needed in society, and people are going to fill the gaps. And it might be some of the corporate leadership for their own self-interests and liabilities, and it might be local governments and state governments, because the need is going to continue. So, you know, stay in the career path, I would say. And I think what we talked about earlier was just having both the soft skills and the hard skills. And what does that look like in terms of each individual? And even just actually acknowledging that you need the full package to do the work, and even if you're not capable of some of those skills, that you need to partner to get across what you're trying to accomplish in your career, you have to be aware of where you need to supplement from what skill set you have. But overall, I would say keep down the path. There are so many opportunities, and you need everybody. You need the public sector, you need the philanthropic sector, you need government, and those all kind of fill in each other when one is a little lower. And so the opportunities are across our society, not just the federal government.
I mean, I would advocate for choosing a career in emergency management. This is a profession that is multidisciplinary and requires the expertise and the skill, hard and soft, of every profession that you can imagine. Because we're doing everything that's before disaster. So think mitigation, think preparedness, think setting up systems that build resilience, think et cetera, and flood insurance, the risk markets that we're in, how do you buy down risk, all these things are before disaster. In the response, if you are a veteran and you've been in the military or you've been in systems of chain of command and moving large commodities and logistics, and think about supply chains that go down. By the way, there's a huge earthquake fault in the middle of the country. When that happens, several states are going to go down. If you don't think the supply chain is going to be wrecked across interstate commerce, think again. There's so much to be thinking about in the response piece of the disaster world, and then the after disaster, the recovery, which is arguably some of the hardest community development, building, designing that can happen in a government or in a community. And it's not just within emergency management at the local level, think county and city, the state level, governor's offices, and certainly the federal level at FEMA, which I would say maybe pause on that for a couple of years until the environment is more supportive of career workforce. But it's only a matter of time before they have to rehire thousands of jobs that have been lost. And oh, by the way, it's not just emergency management within government. You have nonprofits. This work does not happen without the whole community. And nonprofits and foundations and faith-based centers have a huge role to play. Catholic charities, every religion in the US has a disaster component, most likely. I think United Way, food banks, etc. And then the private sector, we have a lot of companies and organizations investing in emergency management. Disney has an emergency manager for every theme park. They treat their parks like little cities, and they think about risk and operations just like cities do. So that's true for stores like Target and Walmart, right? So the private sector is more and more investing in this space because the risk landscape, the threat landscape, because of climate, because of man-made disasters, are getting significantly worse in this country. And more and more organizations are looking at how to bring in expertise to help them address it.
Also, intro to chemistry is always really helpful.
All right, I see 2 questions submitted. Okay, a few. We're gonna go here first.
Hi, so thank you for the discussion, and I think I have the similar question, but I'm curious specifically, before working at the EPA and FEMA, what kind of work or experiences you have, and were they already related to environmental or climate issues, or did you transition to other fields later on?
So I started my career working at Cal EPA under the Schwarzenegger administration in environmental policy. And then I segued really quick to spending over a decade helping to run a public affairs firm with issues and clients from corporate Fortune 500 companies to government to philanthropy across issue areas. Some environmental, like we helped a large wind farm developer secure the political will and the financing to build a 500 megawatt wind farm in southern Washington. Oh, by the way, all that power is coming down to the city of Los Angeles. So the politics of that has been was fascinating for several years, to working on K through 12 education reform to advance equity through the local control funding formula, which was actually a strategy and a policy agenda of Governor Brown, and his office asked us to come in and help lead that campaign to build support for making that happen. So I would say that my expertise wasn't really squarely in the environmental space or even in the emergency management space. My expertise was really in the communication space and thinking about audience and how do you tell stories that change perspective, frame debates, motivate changes in human behavior, getting different stakeholders to come together to agree upon a certain set of goals to build a coalition. It was really those types of skills that I've applied through lots of emergency management at FEMA.
You know, as Justin mentioned earlier, with every challenge there's an opportunity. I also believe with every closed door, there's a new door. And that's been my career experience in having, so before EPA, I was a commissioner at the California Public Utilities Commission, so it was mostly focused on energy issues and telecommunications issues, as a little bit of transportation issues. And then previous to that, I worked for Governor Jerry Brown and was one of his legislative deputies on the environment, on agriculture, on climate. And I could go further back, but most of that was nonprofit and union work. And so it's I don't think there's a straight path for the most part. I think it's, looking for an opportunity in one area and another one opens. And that was my experience and how I got into the governor's office. So keep seeking opportunities that are interesting to you. And even if they don't come into fruition, there will be something that comes out of it.
I think we have time for a couple more questions, and I saw a few, and here, and then time.
Yeah, well, first off, thank you for sharing your insights. I definitely learned a lot from that. I guess my question, bouncing off a previous one that's already been asked, is like, if you guys could tell your younger selves when you're coming out of college or starting off fresh, what would you tell yourself now with the experience you have? And I guess a follow-up I have is, what would you tell yourself specifically if you knew that we would be in a time of such a political turmoil, especially in the environmental field?
One thing we talked about earlier is that I think in my younger self, I thought that this work was non-retractable. I thought that when we made progress on something, yeah, you would maybe step back a little bit, but you wouldn't swing back. And what I would say is, no, society is capable of swinging extremely back, but if you're in this interest and in this world of what you guys are all here for, obviously interested in making our environment better, it's a way of life. It's not something you're going to complete, even if you get through a project, you have to defend it. We've learned that not just in the environmental space. As a woman, we've learned that very harshly with our rights under this administration, is that we have to fight for them every day. And because you have to fight for it every day, you also have to take care of yourself and make sure that you're getting rest and that you're enjoying life. And there's a nice book about resistance and joy, and making sure that I was very much didn't get that for the first 10, 15 years of my career, and understanding that balance, because I think a lot of me thought this was something that had a finite point to it. And so that's what I would share. And of course, get rid of your high school boyfriend before you go to college and all that stuff.
That's good advice.
Yeah,
we can all use that advice. I think that it's the point about rest and kind of the wellness part of it, I think is super important, because those of us who do this work, it's not a job. It's not even a career, it's a life. This is a life. We chose this life because we are called to do it, to work through it, to focus on not only the short-term wins, but the full arc of what we're gonna do with our time on the earth. It's a calling, it's a life. Whether we're serving the people of the state of California or the country in a formal capacity, or doing it with pro bono clients as consultants, it's working towards the same end, and it's our North Star, right? Where we found our version of the North Star. And so I think I was a little bit lost in the beginning of my career because I thought I needed to have a certain title and a certain salary and certain things to help build a ladder to build towards, and that certainly helped me professionally, but it didn't fill my tank, and it led to a lot of consternation or just not feeling fulfilled. And so I wish that I had focused more of my time coming up with and defining my North Star. What is the thing that's going to get you up in the morning? What is the thing that compels you? And it's okay for that North Star to shift and change over time, but you need to have it, because the reality is all of you are going to face an ethical dilemma, a challenge that is going to force you to have to make a decision, or it's going to force you to have to work through gray area or challenging dynamics. And if you aren't super clear what that ethical North Star is for you, that's going to lead to really bad outcomes that either you're going to be embarrassed about or on a really bad path because of.
And you just remind me of something, Justin, because I feel like maybe as a young person, I heard that message, and also I know we share this, which is you need to be in every sector of society. You don't just carry out this work in government.
Yeah.
You don't just carry it out in the nonprofit sector. You carry it out in the private sector, in every sector. And everything that I would say we have worked on, particularly at the state level with tremendous success, has required all of those sectors. And it's like, I mentioned like the wetlands thing. Well, when we have the drought in California, we finally passed a really tremendous act, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. It was because there were leaders in agriculture that were calling for that. In local government, they were calling that.
That's
in
right.
rural communities that were out of water, they were calling for that. So please know that, even corporate America needs you. So it's everywhere. You can go there without losing your values and that star that you're heading towards. And if you are, and you can quit if you don't like it. You know what I mean? So, but you can have an impact there for sure, because we can't do the silo thing anymore. It's all of society.
Right.
Do you think you have time for another
Yes, I
question?
think they'll wrap it up.
Okay, I saw, there's two. I saw you first and then over there. Is that okay if we do two? Martha.
Thank you. I think my question is about strategy and thinking especially about how do we get to the point where FEMA is recovering, the EPA is recovering, especially in the next in a year we have midterms, in 3 years we have the next presidential election. What do you think we should be doing now to rebuild? And I also want to go back to the conversation about mistrust in government. Because we talked about people who have legitimate reasons to distrust government because they've been excluded in the past. But I'm also thinking about, I grew up in upstate South Carolina, which was hit very hard by Helene, and I've seen a lot of the anti-government FEMA sentiment. My research is in the San Joaquin Valley. How do we reach people on issues that have been politicized like climate change and build or rebuild faith in government and belief that these issues need to be addressed? If that makes sense.
Well, one thing, I think maybe we mentioned in our earlier setting, that both Cal EPA and US EPA were started by Republicans. Nixon and Reagan, they were, this is not, it really is hard to say it today in the reality that we're in, but the environment was not a partisan issue. And certainly, we're gonna come back to that. And maybe it's called something different, and I think the harder question is the trust in government, for sure. I mean, I think nobody wants shit in the middle of their front yard, you know what I mean? Basic environmental stuff is nonpartisan. And everybody actually wants these agencies to protect them. You mentioned Ohio, it was they wanted more action out of EPA, So I have more confidence in the fact that there's gonna be an EPA in perpetuity, and it's gonna maybe look different, and it's an opportunity for us to define what that looks like differently. But the trust in government, the onset of AI, is very much do not have the solution for that. It is something that we have to be conscious of course, in all the strategies we talked about. But I hope you have the answer. You're the comms guy.
The same point about FEMA, disasters aren't political either, even though political people are either gonna benefit because they respond well, or they mitigate well, or they recover well, or they don't. But the actual act of it shouldn't be. I mean, I spent more time in red states helping my colleagues at the state level and local level, who politically we couldn't disagree even more. But we worked so well together to solve problems because that's the job. They didn't care that I was a Biden appointee. I didn't care that they were a fill-in-the-blank governor appointee. We had a job to do to keep people safe before, during, and after disaster, and that's it. And I think a lot of this rhetoric right now is really problematic and will ultimately go away. I mean, I think Texas was a perfect example of the narrative was that FEMA needs to go away, FEMA is terrible, FEMA is trash, but when Texas was overwhelmed by that response, they needed the federal government, and the White House had one thing to say: we're sending in FEMA to help. So I think that unfortunately, future disasters are going to have to pound that out a little bit more. And oh, by the way, I can't help but defend my agency, and there's a lot that my former agency got wrong over the decades. But the truth of the matter is, and any emergency manager, whether they'll agree with it or deny it, it is the truth, which is FEMA is often the scapegoat for everyone else in government that doesn't have a better answer, including other federal agencies. The amount of times we would say FEMA was the easy button for the White House, that other federal agencies couldn't figure it out because other federal agencies are not set up, maybe a little bit more in EPA and public health, because of the situations that they're responsible for. But most other federal agencies are not set up to be operational and to have quick boots on the ground to solve problems and to get out of the ivory tower space very quickly. That is FEMA. And so the amount of other problems we had to solve for other federal agencies was astronomical over the last 4 years. Oh, and by the way, when governors and locals don't have a better solution, FEMA is just so bureaucratic. It's the go-to talking point. And I recently was hired to do a talk and an exercise workshop on crisis comms for chiefs of staff of southern state governors. I was like, are you sure you want me? I'm kind of a bleeding heart liberal. And they're like, yes, we want you because your expertise. And I was like, sure, let's do it. And I kind of even said with them, you know, if FEMA goes away, you will not have a scapegoat that I know you all use when you don't have a better answer. And their response was, oh shit, right? Our version of that, because they know that it's true. And so I do think that without that anchor there, the reality of disaster before, the reality of disaster during and after, FEMA will not always be able to be there. And so those truths are going to come to the surface. And I think that a lot of actual work needs to happen from there. So that brings me hope in what we need to be focused on in the next couple of years.
Yeah, and it just basically at the end of the day, who's going to be held accountable? Who's going to make them accountable? Unfortunately, we come to time, but I would again like to thank this amazing group of experts that spent the entire day talking to classes, PhD seminars, and of course this public event about their wisdom and their inspiration for the work that they do. Also, again, like to thank the UCI Climate Collaborative, UCI School of Social Ecology, the Social Impact Hub under Raven, and all of you who came out tonight or this afternoon to listen to this information, and hopefully it gave you hope and inspired you to continue doing the environmental and the climate action work that you're doing. Our guests will still be down here, so I encourage you to come down and if you have any additional questions, but let's give them a round of applause and thank you.